On this episode of Technicolor Blood, we are going to have a retrospective on the career of Stan Lee, who we lost this week at the age of 95.
We're also going to discuss Hollywood screenwriting icon and legend and two-time Oscar winner, William Goldman.
Starting right now on Technicolor Blood. Technicolor Blood, welcome back, guys. Appreciate y'all listening again. I'm here with Terrence, as always. How's it going, Terrence?
And I'm here with a heavy heart today.
Yes, lots of heavy hearts this week. We lost two icons in the entertainment world and in Hollywood. Stan Lee died at the age of 95, and William Goldman died at the age of 87. Stan Lee, of course, basically anything you can think of with the Marvel Universe is his creation or co-creation or contribution. And William Goldman is obviously a legendary screenwriter, and we will talk about both of these guys. We're going to start with Stan Lee. So, Stan Lee, again, 95 years old, a life well lived, obviously, and he just basically touched every part of the Marvel universe, and everything that you know as the Marvel Cinematic Universe today was born of at least part of Stan Lee's contributions, if not straight out him creating the characters.
Yeah, like to put into perspective how large his career is, understand that he was writing Captain America stories during World War II.
Right.
That's how long this guy has been writing.
Yeah, he's been around so long that he actually created the Captain America character when the actual feelings of what made Captain America, you know, its original, what it was supposed to be, was actually going on in the world. That's crazy to think that he's still around up until this week.
I don't know that he created Captain America.
I think Jack Kirby and his buddy Simon something like that. Yeah, he contributed. He was a heavy contributor to it. He actually, apparently Stan Lee's actually came up with the idea of the shield and the fact that the shield could be thrown and returned almost like a boomerang.
Oh wow, yeah, that's so iconic to that character.
Yeah, so he definitely had a part to play. That's kind of what I'm trying to say here. We're gonna mention a lot of characters, and if you're out there grousing over, well, technically he did or did not. I mean, we obviously want to give credit where it's due, but he, as much as he created a lot of characters, he also touched and improved and had something to do with so many others.
Yeah, and to that point, we should probably point out, because we'll probably refer to this quite a bit, he invented something called the Marvel style of writing, the Marvel technique. And that was for him to collaborate with an artist, and they would spitball ideas, they would talk about things, they would bang out kind of a rough concept of the kinds of stories they wanted to tell or the kind of character they wanted to create. Then Stan would sit down and write an actual story for it. And he would just sort of describe it to the artist in broad terms. And then the artist would go out and would draw panels for the comic book pages based on just the outline that Stan Lee had given him. Stan Lee would then take that art and he would write dialogue to the picture and captions and descriptions to the picture. So it was really an intense collaboration between artist and writer. It wasn't a writer simply rendering what the writer had written into picture form. It was a real collaboration. And as a result of that, the actual birth or genesis of characters and concepts and ideas it's a little shady, or well, a little shades of gray, let's say, because you had two people contributing in really, really strong ways. But as the writer, Stan Lee received most of the credit over the years, and in a lot of fans' minds, he's the creator of so many of these things. Stan Lee, to his credit, has always been very, very open about when characters were a combination of him and Jack Kirby or him and Steve Ditko or whoever else.
Yeah.
And that's to the credit of his character.
Yeah. And Stan, he was a guy who had an appreciation for a lot of the early cinematic heroes. Like I know I'd read a while back that he was heavily influenced by the Errol Flynn movies, which, I think we're big fans of a lot of early Errol Flynn, Robin Hood, and the not Black Flag, but it's popping around in my brain. It's my favorite one.
Is it Seahawks or
Captain
Captain Blood?
The Seahawk and actually Captain Blood is the one I was thinking of, but both of those I love. So obviously by the fact that I can remember them off the top of my head. So he was heavily influenced by Errol Flynn. And he grew up in New York and in the Bronx. So I mean, you can really I kind of want to go back and watch the original recent Captain America movie and go back and read some of the early comics just to kind of get the feel for what that was like. Because like we talked about, he was. You think of Captain America now, it's such an old character, but it was written at that time where we needed Captain America,
right?
Because we were fighting Nazis.
Yes.
We don't fight Nazis anymore. Oh, okay. Well, anyway, we were fighting Nazis back then.
The more things change.
Yeah. So, so he just, so much iconic imagery and walk away from just the best known Marvel characters like currently, the Thor and Iron Man and all those, but also
the X-Men, Spider-Man,
right?
And Daredevil.
Exactly. Spider-Man, I guess, is probably his most iconic single character. I guess
I would say so.
And
Spider-Man's got to be the biggest comic book character in the world.
I would guess so. I mean, they're also the big three, I guess. Spider-Man, Batman, Superman. They're also huge. I have no idea which is the biggest, but he also created Thor and the Hulk, and it's just
right.
I mean, I could start naming characters, but we would run out of show. So
yes,
it's just crazy how much influence he's had, and it's just so interesting to me that he has, I don't want to say essentially two careers, but he was already an iconic legend before the Marvel Cinematic Universe kicked off. Like before the movies became a thing, he was already like a god amongst anyone who's a fan of comic books. And somehow he rose higher than that due to the success of the movies.
Right. So, he sort of entered the scene in the 60s when comic books were pretty staid. DC and their style ruled the world. So it was a lot of, super powerful heroes who were very, very morally strongly defined as good guys, and they always overcame the bad guys. And, Stan Lee came on the scene and sort of introduced, characters who had weaknesses, who made mistakes, who worried about the repercussions of the things they were doing. You had Spider-Man, who was just a teenager who struggled with even being able to talk to girls. Those were all kind of new elements that he introduced into that field, and it really broke open comic books to make them not just kiddie books, but something that teenagers and adults could read and really enjoy. And then as he became more and more closely tied to Marvel Comics, he became kind of a cheerleader for Marvel Comics. He sort of became their pitch man and their spokesperson, and he was out there pounding the pavement and selling the world on Marvel Comics and suggesting this idea that if you're a fan of Marvel Comics, you're part of this special community. And by doing that, I think he helped sort of build what we look at as, modern fandom, where it's okay for people to dress as characters and go to conventions and like really, really embrace their pop culture passions. Like he was the guy who was planting those seeds early on. And then, he was a big piece of the spearhead in the 70s and 80s to introduce comic book characters to television. There was a Spider-Man TV series. There was a very, very successful Incredible Hulk TV series, and those came about because Stan Lee was out there really trying to take characters out of comic books and push them into other mediums.
He was always thinking ahead.
Absolutely. In the 90s, he bought an animation company specifically to try to make cartoons like Spider-Man cartoons, but more importantly, because he wanted to use owning a Hollywood production company to make connections with Hollywood producers. Like he was already thinking at that point about trying to usher his creations into big budget Hollywood films. So, he wasn't a producer in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but he was this, he was a force. He was just this force that was like pushing things and getting them into the hands of the right people. He was every bit as important to where superhero movies are today as he was in the 60s, just getting regular people to have an interest in reading comic books at that time.
Yeah, and I love that he understood his strengths. So he obviously created the characters, but he didn't try to direct the movies.
No.
He didn't try to write all the screenplays. He put them in the hands of the people that could do the best for it. And I mean, it's crazy. Like you can really, if you really go down the rabbit hole, I mean, this is a guy who had such a hand in the popularity of comic books, which sort of, I think for a lot of years, it appealed to sort of the misfits. And then, only now it's like one of those things where nerd culture and geek culture is,
is the culture.
They're the creators now.
Yeah.
And he is the window to all that. So he's been on the side of being the misfit and the mogul. And he was, like you mentioned, his writing process, he was story obsessed first. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just like, oh, this is a great concept and here's some pretty colors for the costume, done. He was obsessed with story. He apparently some of his biggest favorite authors, H.G. Wells. He was a big Mark Twain fan. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He was a Shakespeare fan. Dickens. He loved Harlan Ellison. I mean, you can kind of see all the. He was a guy who the story was number one for him, and that's kind of a thing that I think is we're gonna have to need that next generation of creators to sort of take that and run with it, so that we're not just getting things that are based on pretty pictures and a concept.
Right. Yeah, and you have to wonder. I kind of likened him to Walt Disney. At one point, Walt Disney was. He was the face of Disney, and when people thought of Disney, they thought of Walt Disney, mm-hmm. and that was because this was a guy who had just pushed animation, and he saw that it could be so much more than it was, and through his efforts, he drove it in the mainstream and like big movie theatrical releases that were not just for kids, but they were for the entire family. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the live action films that Disney made as well, and then eventually Touchstone down the road. But you see how one guy can take one thing and just see that there's no boundaries to it.
Sure.
And it becomes so much larger. And you see the exact same thing with Stan Lee. I think Disney and Stan Lee were cut from the same cloth in a lot of
sure.
ways. And I think in the same way, Disney has just achieved this, sort of immortality as a personality. I think Stan Lee is destined for the same thing.
Sure. And when you see the movies in a packed theater, it's funny when he has his cameos, you have people of all ages who, burst out into little fits of applause when he shows up on screen. This is a 90-year-old man.
Yes.
And these people that he would think would have no clue who he was. Mm-hmm. Or, maybe there's some of the boyfriends who brought their girlfriends who aren't as familiar, and you can hear them sort of whispering in the theater, that's Stan Lee, that's the guy who created.
Yeah,
blah, blah,
kids
blah.
love Stan Lee. I mean, crazy, you think about it, there's an entire generation of kids who've just grown up on those Marvel films, and the one through line that is in every single one of those movies is Stan Lee pops up.
Yeah.
He's like Santa Claus.
I think, the word legend and icon, that sort of thing, I think gets tossed around a bit too much for what it's truly worth. And I mean, I think both the folks we're talking about today, are just absolute icons and legends. And it's sad to see him go. I didn't actually realize this, but his catchphrase "Excelsior" is actually the New York State motto. I did not know that.
Oh, I did not know that.
Which makes sense, and he's a New York guy.
Yeah, absolutely. He's also the guy that coined the line for Spider-Man, "With great power comes great responsibility."
Great quote.
Yeah, that everybody knows. I don't want to talk too much about kind of the end of his life, but for the last few years, there was definitely a dark cloud over it.
Yeah.
He was involved in some legal woes that were not his responsibility or his fault, but they were the result of accusations of elder abuse. Yeah. He certainly had amassed a large fortune.
Right.
And unfortunately, it seems like there at the end, there might have been some family members and former business associates that decided that they thought they should either manage it for the good of Stan Lee, mm-hmm. or exploit his age and, what comes with being a 95-year-old man, and maybe try to cut out their piece from him.
Yeah.
Either way, it was kind of nasty and unfortunate.
It's disgusting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, of course, now that he's gone, we're gonna start seeing a lot of stories about how all that's going to play out. So,
yes.
But, we obviously want to choose to remember him for the good things. And, it's sad that he's gone. And I mean, he could have lived to be 200, and I don't think his legacy would be cemented, because these movies and all this content and these comics, I mean, obviously not a fad. It is woven into the fabric of this country.
Yeah.
And now worldwide, all loves it too. So, I mean, you and I and everyone listening to this will be dead and gone, and all this stuff will still be going for years.
Right. And that's a good point. Like right now, the people who are running things, both in the comic books and in the movies, they're to one degree or another, they're disciples of Stan Lee, and they want to do things Stan Lee's way. But he's been around for so long that there's, a couple more generations of people who have also grown up on Stan Lee.
Yep.
So as those things move forward and new people take over them, they're still going to be disciples of Stan Lee. Like his legacy, it's going to continue on and guide these things for years to come.
Yep. All right, we'll take a quick break, and we're going to come back and talk about William Goldman. All right, so William Goldman, iconic screenwriter. He's one of those guys that, he's a writer, so people don't really talk about writers very much. And we're as guilty as that as anyone. We talk about directors a lot. We talk about actors. Yeah. We really should be talking about writers a lot more.
That is the truth.
And William Goldman is every bit as iconic in his niche of Hollywood as Stan Lee is, really. He's had a long, long, impressive career, tons and tons of movies that you recognize, historic films, Oscar-winning films, and there he is with just so many impressive credits. I don't want to do him a disservice to blow past a lot of his movies, but just like with Stan Lee, we can't name all his creations. we're gonna run out of hard drive space here.
Yeah, so. I mean, this guy was working the entire time he was alive. Yeah. He never eventually retired or faded out. I mean, he was working right up through the 2000s into the late 2000s. And much like Stan Lee, you can't stress enough the influence that he had on subsequent generations of screenwriters. Sure. I mean, this is a guy who's written 2 very famous books on the screenwriting trade, and they're required reading for people who want to be screenwriters. Everybody knows them, everybody's read them, everybody loves them. They're traded among screenwriters.
Yep.
And he's got one of those personalities where he is just very honest about things. He's very honest about Hollywood, his place in Hollywood, and the place of other people in Hollywood. He's the guy who famously coined the phrase "Hollywood knows nothing" or "nobody knows anything in Hollywood." And that people will tell you to this day that's true. It's just people throwing 1,000 ideas at a wall and hoping one of them sticks.
Yep.
And his books are a delightful expose on that. Very, very entertaining. Not super gossipy, but just kind of really shows you just the wacky insanity that is the inner workings of Hollywood.
Yeah, that guy has some stories for sure.
Yeah.
So we definitely want to hit some of his filmography here. He wrote the screenplay for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which, I mean, you can argue is in the conversation for best Western of all time.
Yep. Best screenplay of all time.
Amazing screenplay. Yeah. And since I harp on this so much, I want to mention, had a great, well-executed ending, which is something that I always complain is something that Hollywood is bad at, is ending their movies.
Yes.
One of the iconic endings in the history of film.
Absolutely. Yep.
And that was just one of those. It's one of those perfect movies. It had great direction, it had great cast, had great writing. Everything was just it was Paul Newman and Robert Redford, of course.
Which at the year that movie came out in 1969, those were the 2 biggest actors in the world in a movie together, just clicking on all cylinders. Yep. I mean, one of those things that the perfect film at the perfect time.
And that was very, very early in Goldman's career. He sold the screenplay for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid for $400,000 in the 60s.
That is a lot of money.
It was the highest amount ever paid for an original screenplay at the time. So you can imagine that's a lot of money for a screenplay now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially for someone who was, I don't think he was unknown at the time, but he definitely was not William Goldman yet.
Yeah.
So that's incredible.
At that point in time, that was, okay, I'm going to retire now money.
Yeah, that feels like the kind of thing where someone decided already, oh, wow, this is going to have Robert Redford and Paul Newman in it.
Yeah.
And we're going to pay for the screenplay before somebody else figures that out.
That's exactly right.
Since they were so huge at the time. He actually isn't credited in this movie, but from I read that he actually was an uncredited writer on Papillon, which is a movie that starred Steve McQueen. It's kind of like a low-key war film favorite of mine.
He did a lot of script doctoring work, which is, uncredited writers who come in and sort of just punch a script up, take it to the next level.
Yep.
Yeah, he did a lot of that.
Some of those guys might come in and provide the most memorable parts of those movies, and then
for sure
they're not really credited for it
Yep.
because they just did punch-up work. More pop culture phenomenon types of movies, The Stepford Wives. Now, had there been social media back in the day, like this would have been, the concept of that movie would have been discussed on social media a lot. I kind of always try to look at some of these past movies through the lens of what it would be like if social media was around back then. That would have been one that got swept up. He wrote the screenplay for All the President's Men.
Yes, won an Oscar for that.
Yep. Oh, I should mention he won an Oscar for the Butch and Sundance screenplay as well.
So those are his 2 Oscar wins right there, about a little less than 10 years apart, but both of them starring Robert Redford.
Mm-hmm. Great movie. Marathon Man was a Dustin Hoffman movie that I don't think a whole ton of people really, it doesn't get really mentioned in the great 70s types of movies. It's probably in that second tier of popular 70s movies.
Yes, but it's the film that sort of solidified that pop culture notion of the Nazis who survived World War II and then escaped down to South America and tried to set up a new Nazi regime. That was something that might have some historical basis. I can't say for sure. But definitely was sort of like a subtle theme from the 70s that this movie was the thing that like really crystallized it and put it into pop culture. And it's still out there today. I mean, you flip on the History Channel and they'll constantly tell you about all these Nazis who survived World War II and built UFOs and mined gold and did whatever crazy stuff the History Channel comes up with. And if it hadn't been for the success of this movie, I don't think that concept would have embedded itself in the psyche of pop culture.
Yeah, and you have some thoughts on A Bridge Too Far.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that movie. Yep. It's a one of those classic World War II films that is a massive ensemble cast. I mean, just tons of actors who were really big at their time were in it, including Sean Connery. And for whatever reason, it doesn't get talked about in the canon of World War II films the way I think it should and the way other ones have. And I've never understood that, but I've always really been a big fan of that film. I've always remembered it since the first time I saw it as a kid. I've seen it a few more times since then. And definitely the screenplay on it it nudges it above just kind of the raw patriotism of a typical World War II film and, brings it a little extra gravitas.
Yeah, which maybe is why it doesn't get mentioned.
That's entirely possible,
Yeah, and there's another one of his biggest, most famous movies after that, The Princess Bride, which he actually wrote the novel for as well and adapted the screenplay. And this, I actually have not read the book, but this is one of my all-time favorite movies, especially from that genre. Just iconic characters, one of those endlessly quotable movies.
Sure.
When you talk about the pop culture contributions of movies, I mean, what's more of a contribution than having a movie that's quotable?
Absolutely.
And this is one of those, just packed with tons and tons of quotable moments.
My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father.
Yes.
Prepare to die.
Mandy Patinkin, man. That guy took that role as far as he could possibly take it.
Yes.
And, Andre the Giant was in it. Of course, Cary Elwes, Robin Wright. I mean, Billy Crystal has a very memorable role in that movie.
Absolutely.
I just love that movie so much. It's so much fun. It's so much whimsy and fantasy, and it's a romantic comedy, and it has giant killer rats. And
it's hard to believe that it was not a success at the time it was released.
Yeah,
it was a bit of a flop, but I mean, one of the strongest cult followings any film has today.
Yeah, it's crazy how that works, and it's such an interesting, because it's so intentionally campy. Yes, but it also it has a great screenplay. Like the obviously William Goldman, that was his thing, and the skeleton of any movie is its screenplay, and it has that rock to sit on, and it's just such a great screenplay. And I love the interaction between the Inigo Montoya character and the Cary Elwes Dread Pirate Roberts character. It's just so aloof and playful, and man, I just love that movie so much. My wife and I actually saw it when it was re-released for whatever anniversary came recently. I think it was the 30th anniversary, We went and saw it in the theater when they did a short re-release run. So
I just, as luck would have it, read the book earlier this year, and reading that book, you cannot read it without picturing that cast performing those roles.
Sure.
That usually drives me crazy. If I've seen a movie before I've read a book, I like to try to forget the actors and the way the director presented it and just let my mind create its own unique take on it. But the casting of these characters is so pitch perfect in every way that it's impossible. You can't. If you read the book, you're going to picture the cast saying it. You're going to hear them saying it in your head. The book is, I mean, obviously Goldman wrote the book, and then later
adapted the screenplay.
Yes. Who directed it?
Rob Reiner.
Rob Reiner. There you go. Yeah. And like that's a match made in heaven. You know, his screenplay, Rob Reiner's directing style, it just it translates that book perfectly.
Yeah. Rob Reiner did a little bit of a intro ahead of the 30th anniversary re-release where he, talked about the, how it was on the set and how it was interacting with the characters. And I'm sure every movie has its problems, but he made it seem like it was the most fun movie set ever. He's got Billy Crystal, like literally ruining take after take after take with his improv where they were just shooting for hours and hours and hours because Billy Crystal just kept making everybody laugh.
Yes.
He couldn't get anything done.
Man, the craziest thing about going back and rereading that or reading that book for the first time is the one actor who I did not expect to embody their character as perfectly as they did is Andre the Giant.
Right.
I mean, even he's so right for that role.
Yeah. I can't imagine who else could have played it. Even Christopher Guest was in that, and he was great as the six-fingered man. Just packed so full of great characters. Harry Hamlin,
yes,
as the prince. I mean, for the love of God, if you haven't seen The Princess Bride, if you aren't convinced by now, see it, and if you don't like it, never listen to the show again.
Well, that's a bit harsh. We definitely want you to keep listening.
I mean, they're dead inside if they don't enjoy it. So.
Well, all right, fair enough.
All right. So another iconic one, and this is another one that I think would have been something discussed and on Twitter, in current day, Misery.
Yes.
Talk about perfect casting, Kathy Bates, James Caan. It's basically the two of them. And man, that was a pop culture phenomenon before social media obviously was ever a thing.
Maybe at the time of its release, that might have been the best adaptation of a Stephen King novel.
It's one that I always forget because when you think of Stephen King adapted movies, you think of all the bad ones first,
Yes.
And then people always bring up The Shawshank Redemption, even though it's not really the same tone as the rest of his movies. But, this is the one that may even still be the best one, I guess. And obviously the Shawshank, like we said. Definitely,
if you have never seen Misery, it's worth watching. You should go check it out.
There's some very pop culture-y stuff that happens in that movie, and I feel like there's probably a decent amount of people who might be listening to this who haven't seen it. So I just want you to see it and experience it on your own.
It's definitely old enough now that I think it's sort of fallen off most people's radars.
Sure. Yeah. He also wrote Maverick, which is sort of a forgotten Western comedy.
Yes.
With Mel Gibson.
James Garner, Jodie Foster. Yep. Yeah. Big. I'm a big fan of that movie. I never watched the show that it was based on. So I kind of only know the film, but it's just a fun, feel good movie.
Yeah.
Like the characters bounce off each other. The cast just really clearly got along. It's just a highly enjoyable film. Yeah. If you're a fan of Mel Gibson and you haven't seen it, or if you just want to remember what it was that made him so charming and popular,
peak Mel Gibson.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the movie to check out to see. And that same time, maybe the same year, the movie Chaplin came out. That was also written by William Goldman. And that is sort of famous because that was a big breakout role for Robert Downey Jr. He definitely would not be the actor that we know today if he hadn't knocked that role out of the park. He plays Charlie Chaplin and recreates several of Chaplin's most famous bits from movies, and he recreates them seamlessly. I mean, he just does them so well, and then his just natural charisma just pours through. So it's not someone aping Charlie Chaplin. It's somebody who is being just as entertaining as Charlie Chaplin was at the time. Of kind of the classic Hollywood biographical films, this is definitely one of the strongest. And if you're a fan of Chaplin or just want to see a really strong performance from a very young Robert Downey Jr., this is a movie to check out as well.
Yeah, he's just, man, you can't say enough about William Goldman. I screwed up because I didn't want to sort of wrap up talking about one of his historic missteps. I mean, we can just drop it entirely if you want, but he also did write the screenplay for Dreamcatcher.
Yes,
Stephen King was involved. Lawrence Kasdan was involved. I want to make sure we spread blame equally here.
Right. So, there's bad movies that are bad because they're just low budget and nobody's trying very hard on them. And those can be so bad they're good, and they're bad in a forgivable way.
Right.
And then there are movies that are bad just because everybody did everything wrong.
Yes.
Dreamcatcher is one of those movies. So, Chris just hit you up with the people involved with this movie who were at the peaks of their careers at the time this movie was released. You had Oscar winners doing the screenplay, and Oscar winners producing, and Oscar winners acting in it, and an Oscar winner directing it. These were all Oscar winners. And this movie had a big budget, and this movie was expected to be a huge box office success. And it is wretched.
Yeah.
It is so bad, and everybody in it is bad at what they do. It's just one of the greatest historical missteps to ever come along.
Lawrence Kasdan directed it. Obviously, Stephen King wrote the novel it was based on. William Goldman wrote the screenplay. It has Morgan Freeman and Thomas Jane.
Oh,
and Jason Lee was in it in that brief time where Jason Lee was in a bunch of movies. And oh man, I'm forgetting the other guy who played Winters in Band of Brothers. He was like basically the main guy in the movie. Damian Lewis.
Ah, yes.
So Timothy Olyphant was in it. I mean, it was one of those. And correct me if I'm wrong, because we saw this we saw it in the theater. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to say that the trailer actually made it look pretty good. Like, we were intrigued by the trailer.
I can't remember the trailer.
I think that was the case, because when we went there and watched it, I specifically remember way back when this movie came out, we were in the movie theater. And we kind of like leaned over and we're doing that thing that we do sometimes, like, okay, should we bail on this? Because this is really bad. And I think you wanted to bail. And I said, whoa. This has a chance to hit the all-time bottom 5. We're sticking this through. Okay, we spent way too much time talking about the bad part, the one little horrible misstep. So I want to get away from that. So I will bring up one other piece of interesting trivia. And I'd forgotten about this. But if you remember, William Goldman was also always rumored to be the true architect of the Good Will Hunting screenplay.
Yes, I remember that, yes.
So, and he's been asked about it several times, and he always flatly denies it. He says, he met with them and he talked to them, and that was the end of it. But it's always been this like sort of weird Hollywood lore rumor that William Goldman like was actually the guy who wrote the screenplay, who made it what it was. And, Ben and Matt just sort of got all the credit for it, and obviously the stardom and the careers.
Yeah, so if you guys remember, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon wrote the screenplay to Good Will Hunting. Matt Damon was, of course, the lead. Ben Affleck is also in it. And they won an Oscar for that screenplay, and it, of course, launched their careers to where they are today. They're still huge A-list writers, and everyone was like, wow, it's amazing the two writers could get together and write such a incredibly subtle and nuanced screenplay, and then neither of them ever write anything ever again. So,
strange, huh?
Yeah, the rumor had always been that William Goldman might have been the guy who actually wrote that.
Yep.
Like Chris says, he's been asked several times about it. He always denies it, but that rumor has never gone away.
Yep. Yeah, he apparently also was approached to, but turned down the opportunity to write the screenplay for The Godfather.
Oh.
And also for the original 1978 Superman.
Oh, wow.
Missed opportunities. Just so curious how differently those both great movies,
yes,
in their own right, how they are now would have been different. So
yeah. So to wrap it up, let's not end it on a sour note or even some of the rumors. Let's take a moment to also remember that as the screenwriter of All the President's Men, he wrote the movie that for most of America sort of defined the events of the Watergate scandal.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a movie that still resonates today. You can watch that movie right now, and it is just as weighty and just as relevant. Honestly, maybe more relevant now than at any point since it originally came out. Yeah. And it's also, interestingly, one of the movies that the Russo brothers credit for the success of their tenure with Captain America.
Huh, interesting.
Especially on Captain America 2 Winter Soldier. They, in every interview, directly point to All the President's Men as a key piece of inspiration for them. It's the reason Robert Redford is in that film, in fact, just to really tie up the connection between those two films.
Interesting. I'd never heard that actually about the Russos. All right. Well, I think that was an appropriate send off for two of the great icons of all time. So we will definitely miss them. And obviously, if you guys want to hit us up and remind us of the many things we left out intentionally, we don't have so much time here. At TechBloodPod on Twitter, hit us up, let us know what you think, and we will be back soon with yet another episode.
Thanks a lot, everybody. I hope you go watch some of the news media.